Good evening. My name is Patty Demuyt, and I am a part of the architectural sales team at USG. USG has been a leader of manufacturing business materials for over 115 years, and our ongoing research has enabled us to bring innovative solutions to building challenges. In fact, we use cutting-edge technology to elevate and pinpoint product properties like acoustics in order to really support your efforts to connect design, business, and the human experience. So USG's vision extends beyond manufacturing. Really, if you think about breakthrough ideas, they come when we better connect and understand the needs of the people that we work with and the communities that we serve. So tonight's forum here is designed to explore the needs of acoustics in this community. This is Acoustics Matters panel event. This is the first of a series of events that are designed to explore the role of acoustics within the workplace environment. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel. We have John Longman, who is founding principal of Longman Lindsey, the acoustical consulting firm. We have Joan Blumenfeld. She's principal at Perkins. We have Ethan Bordeau, who is the sound council lead at the Well Building Institute. We have Bill Bouchey, who is director of interior design at HOK. We've invited these leaders here to really reflect on a decade of explosive global workplace. So it's at this point that I want to pass the baton to acoustical specialist, USG's acoustical specialist, Andrew Schmidt.
Thank you, Patty, for that excellent introduction. We have a lot to cover here tonight, but we hope that you all leave with some greater understanding of acoustics and perhaps some food for thought as it relates to your own design work. I'd like to start with our first question. Why has there been an increased interest in acoustics in office design in the past several years?
Since I'm probably the oldest person on the panel, I'll start out with some history. Around the early 2000s, office design really started changing. And as it started changing and becoming more open, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, there started to be an interest in what people were calling productivity at the time. They couldn't really identify what that was, but there was no real understanding or research around what that was, but they were really interested in, does the more open environment really make people work better? Does it make them work worse? What happens? So people started getting interested in some research. There started to be some firms that, like the Energy Project, which was Tony Schwartz, who actually was the ghostwriter for Trump's biography, which is another story, but like the Energy Project, it looked into employee engagement. He's a really interesting guy. And then there were a bunch of firms started planning strategy groups. People started really looking at what was making people happy and unhappy at work. And there started to be a lot of research around what actually people were thinking and what was making them, what were their pet peeves. So at the same time, they were starting to realize that one of the things that made people more or less engaged was wellness, that when people were not feeling well or were depressed, they were not good employees. So those two twin things started. One of the first kind of wellness initiatives was started right here in New York City with active design, under the Bloomberg administration, looking at how physical activity can really make people better, feel better at work. But that also led into a whole bunch of post-occupancy evaluation type things, like the Leesman Index, which actually, at this point, I think they have 150,000 respondents, looking at where people started really complaining. And one of the chief complaints they were finding was complaining about acoustics. And I think Ethan actually has a lot to say about that.
Sure. I guess to deliver some context, as I think the youngest person on this stage. So, right, as Joan was saying, in the 2000s, we start seeing this influx of the desire to incorporate wellness into the built environment. And one of the places where that was emerging was in the green building certification movement started by USGBC and their development of the Center for Green Schools, which is formerly led by current IWBI President Rachel Gutter, which was one of the first instances where acoustics was introduced as a precondition requirement for projects pursuing certification for green schools. And that introduced a number of challenges for acoustical reasons, where designers and acousticians were, for the first time, trying to convene to discuss what these solutions can look like for implementation purposes. But as the years went on, and forthcoming research from institutions such as the Center for the Built Environment and UC Berkeley, indicating that there are multiple indoor environmental qualities that do ultimately impact our health and well-being, it wasn't until Delos Living saw an opportunity in that to develop something that we would later know as the WELL certification. And as we see it now, as it's developed over a course of time, WELL certification includes parameters for acoustic planning and acoustic threshold requirements, which do ultimately tie back to health and well-being. So as it stands now, health and well-being, projects who pursue WELL certification are always required to undergo some degree of acoustic planning. But this is only the beginning of what we're seeing as being market development and transition to incorporate wellness as a ubiquitous element in high-performing spaces.
It's interesting what you mentioned about the Center for, and what is it, the Center for the Built Environment at UC Berkeley, because they've done some macro studies, and what the macro studies show is that over 60% of occupants in open offices think acoustics interfere with their ability to get their job done. So that's a huge kind of statistic to deal with, and it really, I think, actually, there are some European countries now, we were talking about this before, where I think Finland just instituted some acoustic metrics that are by law required in terms of something called speech intelligibility, which we'll talk about a little bit, what John will sort of touch on later. But so there are actually some countries now where they're starting to legislate some of this, which is interesting.
What are some design characteristics that promote good acoustics, and what are some that promote or pose specific challenges?
Let's talk a little bit about acoustics, and we're going to start out by talking about what constitutes bad acoustics in a space. And before we do that, I think it's important to identify some of the acoustic parameters that define a space, because we always think about the most obvious is like how loud, or in this day and age, and sometimes more prevalent, is how quiet is a space, and that impacts the environment. The classic that is happening at the moment with background noise is the transition of private offices away from the facade, where you have environmental noise from traffic and so forth coming into the building, and you've got a lot of solar gains, you've got a lot of HVAC activity happening at the perimeter, and we have a lot of interior offices. The interior offices obviously don't have traffic noise. They don't have much requirement for HVAC. They're extremely quiet. So background noise is detrimental to a space if it's too loud, but it's also detrimental if it's very quiet. So that's the first parameter. The second is what type of surface finishes do we provide in the space? And again, there's no right answer or wrong answer to this, but it's a case of, do we need a product on the ceiling? Do we need a product on the floor to soften the space? And it's dependent upon the type of space that we're designing as to what is appropriate there. But in a simple situation, if you look at a conference room, conference rooms do need soft surfaces for human interaction, but they need it more importantly for AV systems. Electronics are a lot more sensitive than the human ear, and what microphones pick up is very much dependent upon what we do and what we provide in those spaces. So surface finishes are also very important. The third parameter, the last one I was going to mention, is what we call barriers. It's a question of walls and doors. So we've got a lot of open plan spaces, and one thing that we try and do in modern offices is give people private spaces where they can go and have that phone call. And so the walls and the doors and the barriers that we create so that they can have privacy are also important. So when we talk about bad acoustics, I guess the real definition that I came up with is bad acoustics occur when spaces are designed that don't meet the user group's requirements. And it's very simple to say that, but what we do as acoustical engineers is trying to work out what each individual user group needs, because this is not one size fits all. This is not a black and white science subject. It's about delving into specific requirements and responding to that.
So it's good. We need to define what bad acoustics are. But in terms of good acoustics and design characteristics that promote good acoustics, Bill, I know you had some thoughts as to some of the more, we were talking about it earlier, just framing up what is the approach, or how do we even begin to approach these issues?
I think the group really centered on this question in dialogue around assessment.
Yeah.
And when you're at the beginning of client engagement with your client community, it really speaks to how you go about diagramming and assessing what the needs are. And the things that are really helpful as tools in this instance have to go to understanding at the moment of discovery, visioning and programming, what the needs of specific groups are and how they differentiate from other programmatic client groups as well. So the points of utilization and observation of existing space to understand the behaviors and what the challenges, impediments, and successes are in existing space, and how to build on that with action items. When you're looking at the planning of spaces and you're working with the programmatic knowledge, the assessment of your client groups, how are you planning space to assess what is public, semi-public, and semi-private? How do you assess the context of a site and a program to understand where the opportunities for the most trafficked areas versus the quietest spots within the physical building or the floor plate of the place that you're designing? And last but not least, how you engage in survey groups, polling groups to understand behaviors and activities and take the utilization data around how space is used and come up with findings and implications that lead you to come up with solutions for options that you consider in the schematic design process.
It really does begin with planning, and that leads us nicely into our next question, which is, what are some best practices or methodologies for promoting good acoustics in the workplace?
I think one of the first things that as designers we look at is zoning, and it's actually really interesting to me, and I've actually given a talk on this, how similar interior design is to urban design. It's a lot more similar actually than architecture is. It's really dealing with circulation, with the field, with different types of activities and how they all relate and how you map those all together. This is kind of an oversimplification, but you can divide spaces up into basically 4 groups. It's a little arbitrary and a lot of these overlap. But the quietest spaces are where people really want to go, close the door, do heads down work, not be bothered by anybody else. They're usually just one person and by themselves. The second is a focus space where you can be with other people, like you can be at your workstation, but you are focused on an individual task. You're not working with somebody else. The third kind is like a buzzier space, like a space where you do expect that there's going to be some kind of activity and noise, and that's okay. That's really what makes the space a fun space to be in. It could be a pantry, or it could be, a kind of informal meeting place or whatever. And the last one, which does overlap to a certain extent with the buzz space, is a collaboration space. And we all deal with these, we know what they are. And actually in the next image, I've just taken one of our plans and kind of color-coded what kind of spaces are where. And I think by zoning it in this way, you can really try to separate out the different kinds of spaces so they don't impinge on each other. And with the kind of most collaborative and buzzy spaces nearer the circulation, the focus spaces slightly more in, and the quiet spaces furthest away, so that you can kind of duck back there and nobody else will bother you. And so you put your phone rooms and kind of single or 2-person meeting rooms way at the back, and then try and separate out the buzzier spaces with some kind of shielding, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And by doing that, I think right away you will alleviate a lot of the issues that come up. And I am assuming here also that when we design the space, we're designing a space that has these kind of choices for people, and that it'll be acceptable, of course, for them to be able to leave their work, their desk or whatever, and go to one of these spaces whenever they feel like they need to. I think that's something that's a new concept, a fairly new concept over the past, say, 10 years. I still do remember, like, people clients saying, well, I don't like having the cafe space where in view of like the manager's office, because I don't want him seeing me sitting there. He'll think I'm not doing my job. So I think we've kind of moved away from that, or most people have, but this kind of planning does require that people have the ability to migrate like that.
Joan, I love this diagram. To build on some of what you're saying, right? This is a great postcard from a change management process as well. Not only is this a diagram for engaging a client around how groups might be located and the way workflow occurs in a space, when it comes much further down in the schedule and the process and people are preparing to make a move to a location, is exactly the kind of visual that builds upon helping train and make people ready to move into a new environment. In addition to that, it helps specific people like your change management ambassadors think about how to apply their groups when it comes time to think about departmental locations, blocking and adjacency, team locations. A sales team that's out of the office 50% of the time may want to be in the green zone because it is the most populated area. It might have the highest level of sound incidence because it's on the main circulation path. A group that is more quiet in their work habit natures, whether it's human resources or a data programming group, or some people that are product specialists might want to be in the quietest corners of the floor plate because those zones have the least visual and acoustical interruption. And those are the kinds of levels of conversations that need to be had to make an organization change ready to take on an occupancy of a space.
And you had some different examples here that I think you wanted to share with us, some different examples.
Sure. I mean, Joan touched upon the history of space development, right? And John spoke about one size doesn't fit all, right? So the sandwich of acoustical ceiling, what happens in the vertical layer and the foundation or the floor level as well, changed rapidly 15 to 20 years ago, where the open office took on a significant percentage of increased square footage and presence. And so how do you design for that? Because with the hierarchical flip, from less enclosed space and more people moving out of private offices, noise, behavior, and activity, both with technology and with other people, came out into the open plan. It's not just in workplace, it's in hospitality, it's in higher education institutions. We see it across the broad spectrum. The upper left photo really speaks to layering. How do you go about as a strategy looking at an individual space? You may have an overall blanket approach to an acoustical intervention at the ceiling level and at the floor level, but then you might have a series of space types that have differing needs from the level of semi-open or semi-closed places. So here, we're looking at wall treatments, floor treatments, what kind of ceiling treatments. And so the menu of a la carte solutions that get applied here might be very different than a space that is adjacent to this or further along where it is. In the far right-hand space, we've all seen in the last 15 years the proliferation of individual, heads down, and small-scale group spaces, right? So this foam room is an example of how treatments help bring a level of visual and acoustical isolation to activities that need to be one-on-one concentrated in nature. The lower left image you'll see twice in this presentation for the purposes of this point in the discussion. That represents the built product of a space that was modeled in tandem collaboratively with the acoustical consultant so that the acoustical needs of the space were looked at diagrammatically in structural form before we designed elements and selected materials to clad and treat that space.
It's interesting because exactly when you were talking about modifying the materials to meet the needs, there's also some surprises in there that we found that are non-intuitive, and we were talking about this before, and this is why we definitely need people like John. We actually did kind of an unintentional experiment with our own offices. We moved into a space that was an open office, and we value engineered the carpet out. It had an open ceiling, and it was really, guess what? It was really noisy. That's not surprising. And then we built out a space up on the 18th floor in the same building, exactly the same layout. But on that one, we put a carpet in. We didn't have, but we left the ceiling open. And then we did on the on the 6th floor, I think it was, we did another office, a temporary office for the New York Police Academy team. And on that one, the DDC wanted a drop ceiling. So we had a drop ceiling and we had carpet. all with exactly the same layout and the same configuration and columns and windows in the same places. And guess which one was the best for acoustics? We would have thought, I would have thought originally that it was going to be the one with the drop ceiling and the one with the carpet, because it was the quietest. It was definitely the quietest. But interestingly enough, that one was the most annoying to people, because it was so quiet that when somebody was talking, you could hear every word they said. If they were on the phone, or they were talking to their friend, or they were whatever, if they were at the desk across from you or whatever, because it was so quiet. There was no, and this is what John was talking about before, it's not the level of noise, it's the level of speech intelligibility that is the most annoying to people. And so, like, how you figure out what those materials need to be to promote that little bit of buzz that kind of kills your understanding of what people are saying if they are making noise around you is a really interesting question.
So your experiment is exactly what we try and do on a day-to-day basis, and you worked out what was good for you. So how we look at this is trying to get into your company's culture and have a look and see what is appropriate, and then deciding and working with the design team and the client as to exactly how do you solve the problem the first time around, as opposed to having to do 3 different offices and then deciding which one you like. And what you said is exactly the way it is. It's like, you know what, there's many choices, many options, and you don't necessarily know which one it is straight away. You got to work through it. And Bill's example there of the double height lobby space shows what technology can do, because as we were talking before, a space like that, and once you get to a monumental space, something that's very different, out of the ordinary, tools today allow you to model it. You can not only model it and see how things interact and how things work out for the better or for the worse, but you can actually demonstrate it through oralizations, and spaces like that, as we were talking, sometimes have the acoustics be the driver, and architecture then follows. And so as a consultant, it's then our responsibility to find products, which is where the great steps or strides have happened, I believe, in acoustics in the last 10, 15 years, is finding products that are aesthetically not just pleasing, but excellent, that designers like to bring that sort of designs to life.
I'll add on to that too by saying that I think what makes that example so great too is that it's also what you said at the top of this too, is the idea of post-occupancy evaluation to see what eventually becomes high performance for different particular populations. And so I think that speaks to the efficacy of finding ways to make that more ubiquitous in design, is how do you eventually circle back around and say, you know, we have provided this solution here, maybe you're part of the same organization in some instances, to say we have different solutions here, which one do you prefer? And then building those as case studies to refer back to later is very important.
Moving on, how has modern office design changed to respond to some of these acoustic issues that have arisen? Bill, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I'm not sure I'm going to answer this directly. I'm going to flip the equation for the purpose of discussion, right?
Okay.
But if we move on to the images here, let's kind of start this part of the conversation with what's changed, right? So we speak about 10, 20, 15 years ago. So what project today doesn't typically have some type of common space, a gathering space where people come together of varying scales and sizes? Sometimes a large group approaches the level of a public assembly space. Sometimes it's that and larger, but in the same guise that moving to more open spaces and flexible spaces and multi-purpose spaces, it brings noise and activity into play differently in every single space type, right? So all of these represent gathering spaces. The one on the right is a 2-story space at Group M at 3 World Trade. But the difficulties with this was opening up the slab and creating an assembly space that was public assembly for 200 people plus, but at the same time coming up with all the right level of acoustical treatments that didn't destroy the original idea and enhanced the audibility for a place that was both gathering, alternative, and a place for large-scale technology-based presentations to large groups that were interactive. All of these spaces bring into host and play a number of issues and challenges. The two on the left are smaller scale and size, but nonetheless they're multi-purpose. So the acoustical treatments that work for a large group have to do double duty and function when a team of 10 or 20 wants to use that as an alternative place at perhaps a quieter time of the day, because that is the place where that group can comfortably gather and actually connect and commune and achieve some type of work product tasking that needs to happen. So these are many types of spaces that have come into play of grand scale. And so this is another example of one of the challenges that we have to make. I think the issue here for all of us is making sure that these are right-sized spaces, but more importantly, how do they do that? In the lower left, you've got a space that does double duty for a client as a performing space for musicians, right? So the treatments here, while trying to achieve a loft-like industrial look in Times Square, was the major challenge for us. The affordability, all the money went into the mediation of an element that was painted black to mediate sound transference vertically, and how we treated the underside of slabs.
There, I know John and many acoustical consultants talk about ABC, which I always forget what it is and I have to look, which is absorb, block, and cover. And actually, never mind, I was going to tell a joke, but I'm not going to. If you look at this, the slide on the left is showing an example of absorb. That one, it's a little hard to see, but the dark surface of the little conference room is all carpet. It's really intended to be really quiet in there so people can talk intimately. If you look, there's like a buzzy space right outside of it, and then there's some carpet on the floor, and I don't know if you can see it, but in the back there's hanging screens that are made out of felt. So all those things kind of accommodate slightly different kinds of activities that we're foreseeing that are going to happen in those spaces. On the right is actually, it's a detail from a project that actually Brent Capron in the audience here did for Viacom. And they had a value engineering issue, and Brent came up with the idea of salvaging a bunch of the ceiling tiles that they were demolishing and using them, painting them black, using them both in the ceiling but also as wall covering in some of the conference rooms. And it works really well. It looks great as an acoustic absorptive material. The two bottom projects were actually worked on by Arjav Shah, who's also in the audience. The one on the left, Hafely, they were all about hardware, so it's all about sliding this and sliding that. And they have all these different kinds of sliding doors, ways to close off spaces. Some of them have really good acoustic properties, some of them not so much, but there are tons of ways to come up with different solutions for blocking off spaces when they're used for different purposes, and that's also kind of an interesting way to solve some of these issues. And the last one on the right is a space for a client where we were looking at sound masking, because from the photograph it looks like there's no acoustic material in the space, but there is sound masking in the ceiling in white noise. But what we were exploring, which we didn't implement with this client, but I'm convinced there is a solution out there somewhere, maybe one of you will be able to accomplish this. What Arjav was looking at was turning that light fixture into like a speaker and working with the lighting consultant and the acoustic consultant to try to make that work. They just never got there with this particular client, but I am convinced that that kind of a product has a future. I think, and we'll talk about this a little later, I think there is a future in products that do more than one thing.
Absolutely, and we will touch on that later. And there's an image here, another image here for you, Bill. Images that you shared with us were getting into kind of specific solutions to some of these challenges.
Sure, I mean, the more we've dragged open space out into the open, right, it's no longer what it is. So the upper left, there's a rare project these days that a stair, an interconnecting stair as a connector, is ceremonial. It is often an activator. And so the types of designed settings that we bring to it, where it's a place of circulation, where people come together serendipitously, where there is casual collision, where it is an alternative workplace. What workplace anywhere in the nation or in the world isn't working hard with the metrics against plannable square feet per people and the ability to have agility and activity-based planning to allow variety and choice? Staircases are no exception to the rule in terms of populating and activating. The upper right space for Teach for America does a very similar thing in a multi-purpose space, and it allowed us to push all of the acoustical treatments to the top of the two-story cavity. But we mediated on the lower level as well by pulling the space further inward. So both the planning and the treatments had to work closely together for that to be a successful space for large and small group. We talked about the reception area in the lower right before. The model really followed the recommendation from the acoustical co-creation exercise, and through a series of cantilevered planes that also incorporated return air and lighting from a kind of infrastructure standpoint, and changing a wood floor proposal on a raised floor environment, using it as a vertical cladding and turning it into an acoustical wood with a percentage of perforation, was the series of elements that solved for that space. It kept the original idea kind of intact. And I think had we started down that road without the acoustician as our equal partner, we would have been further down the road to achieve that kind of result. I like to talk about the booths on the lower left because that is a space type in the last 15 years that has dominated not just workplace, but many other types of places, whether it's a coffee shop, a breakout at a hotel, an alcove and a mezzanine above a bar. They're everywhere, and they serve great purpose, right? Because it's that ideal setting that is semi-public, yet semi-private. However, if you bring technology to it and you have more than 2 people in these settings, you need to mediate on a number of levels. And so not only does the level of drywall and high-performing acoustical gypsum products need to come into play, but surface treatments in that as well. And so they serve a great purpose as a setting that's opened up. They're not going away, and I think they're here for us to deal with.
And Bill, I think exactly what you're showing here, we look at these beautiful images and we don't necessarily think about where we came from. And when you think where we came from 5, 10, 15 years ago, it shows what the trends are. And the trends are developing products that are aesthetically 10 times, 100 times better than they used to be. 15 years ago, you said you needed something acoustical. It's like, what did you have to play with? A lay-in tile, tectum, some popcorn. Something like that. Now you've got an array of products that are like amazing. They're more receptive to the design that you're trying to institute. The other trend that has happened, we look at private offices. 10 years ago, when people first started using office fronts, they were just glass with just sloppy doors. They didn't have much privacy. Now all the manufacturers have stepped up their game. You get nice gasketed doors, and the products are just getting more and more developed and responsive to the needs that designers are requiring. So I think that's where the trends are, and that's where the trends are going to go in the future. They're going to develop products that are even better that you're going to want to use.
I think product solutions help us, but how many in the audience that are doing workplace design have as a client who in recent years has converted to an activity-based workplace, a more agile workspace? We've got clients with recently built spaces that are introducing sit-stand as a typical and a standard. We've now got audio rising up in a transmission height in an open plan environment where previously it was around 36 to 42 inches in a seated position. It is bringing a host of acoustical problems. The moment people start to stand for a portion of the day and conduct video conference and audio conference calls from their desks, whether they've got sound muffling, headphones, microphones, and other, is introducing a whole new challenge for us in going back and retrofitting these environments. And we're looking to the marketplace, to product solutions. If you're retrofitting that space, you think you're only going to solve it by adding an acoustical layer at the ceiling, think again. It might have to be a combination of that and a hybrid lighting fixture that brings acoustical properties and elements to it that also mediate that.
And it really puts the onus on the manufacturers to really rise to the occasion to develop these products that meet these changing needs. Let's move on to our next question, and this is something that we talk about at USG quite a bit, about treating acoustics and acoustic design as an imperative, as a true design imperative. And so, John, I want to direct this to you. How do you make sure that acoustics is treated as a design imperative in your projects?
Well, it goes to what we were talking about at the beginning. You first of all have to understand that this is no one size fits all. So you have to determine, and we can look at, let's just give 2 extreme examples. Law firms, very traditional, they need, or they expect a certain level of acoustics. You go to the high-tech firms on the other end, the Googles and such, and they're very happy with a very raw, very energetic, very loft type of environment. So those are the 2 extremes. I think, how do you ensure you have good acoustics? You first of all have to decide with your client what it is they're looking for. And one of our primary roles in the project is not only to be there early, but is to get inside those clients' heads and to help them walk down this road to getting their new space. And, you know, the road is a windy road. There are decisions that have to be made, and clients all have budgets. Very few of them have unlimited funds, and so decisions have to be made, and it's educating them on what they're going to get as they go down this road. And so what we do is it's like we look at the spaces, we look at the planning that is obviously being done, and because everything in traditional or in modern offices is very much about collaboration, we look and see where those, as Joan says, those buzzy spaces are, and we look and see how to try and keep them open and collaborative, but make sure that they don't adversely impact the first few offices that are right next door, or benches that are right next door, who are going to complain that everybody in the kitchen in the morning is interrupting. So it's planning, it's looking at surfaces, it's looking at how to treat various spaces, where you need to put walls and doors. But it's most of all, the most important aspect is educating the client and working out exactly what it is they want. And then working with the design professionals in respecting the aesthetic of a space. We can't come in and just suddenly change everything. That doesn't work. And the bottom line is, if you do that, then we've talked about monumental spaces that you can model, you can demonstrate through. We've done some in terms of 3D computer models. You can do it through oralization if you've got a special space. The name of the game is to make sure there's no surprises at the end of the day. And that takes a little bit of work, and it's a collaboration.
I think what you said about educating a client is really important, because I think some of the research that's been done really is interesting, and it's good to support a kind of anecdotal approach to why this is important, to show that there really is an impact on productivity, an impact on people's engagement and how they feel about their workplace. And I think if you're I'm working on any large project that has any non-typical office spaces, you really run a risk of causing problems that might be difficult to correct later on. I think just modern office design has evolved in such a way that it really works across purposes to some of what a good acoustics would want to be. One of the things that we didn't talk about it, but has been sort of assumed, is with the more open office, there's a lot more transparency. We have all these glass walls. Glass walls are not, glass is not a good acoustic material. How do you deal with that? And I think, the fact that now almost every conference room has AV in it, and microphones and all this other stuff, you need to be really careful about what the finishes are in that room to counteract how that actual glass wall is going to reflect the sound. There are a lot of trends that we've started that do need different kinds of solutions, and I think that's why we've seen this efflorescence of great products over the past, and that yes, you can design a space using rules of thumb for partition types, for where to put finishes and things like that, but I think in order to really, truly work out how the most ideal situation working with a consultant really is a huge help. Another thing that actually does help also in terms of trends, which is interesting, that I forgot to mention, is also the fact that a lot of clients are moving towards free address. I think that actually helps with some of this, because when people feel the acoustics are unpleasant, they can actually move into a different kind of space. So there are some unexpected pluses for something like a free address system that actually helps out with some of the acoustic issues.
One of the things that relates to that we're finding, when we get to the point of design development and we're doing the acoustical review as it relates to design solutions, clients want the business case to have already been built. And when we go back to the assessment piece that I mentioned earlier, what we're finding is that sometimes, particularly in larger projects, when we have multiple types of groups within the overall client community, that we have to identify what are the client profiles. So what is the typical day in the life like for each of these knowledge workers or employees in each of these groups, and how does that factor into activity, daily usage, percentage of time in and out of the office, amount of time spent collaborating, meeting, and doing individual work. And what does that look like as an aggregate summary of headlines about the space? Because by the time we get to design development and we're talking about the recommended solutions that are based upon our acousticians' report, we need to be able to justify it and be able to bank it against utilization-based observations, surveys, client profiles that are a tool that are based upon a day in a life. We've got to build the case by that time, because to have to go back and have to rework that work, or to have it pause on question while the rest of the design advances, is a recipe for disaster around playing catch up later for cost and documentation. And so again, it relates to that as well.
Yeah. And that's really the key, is value engineering is always, the worst enemy of acoustics. And so how do you make sure that, your acoustic design that you work so hard, you plan it, you get in there from schematic design, design development, how do you make sure that those elements stay in the design through the value engineering phases is always one of the biggest challenges that I had as a consultant during my consultant days.
Well, you have to, under those, every job has value engineering. You have to decide some things are deal breakers, and you have to fight for them, and others are nice to haves, and that's where you sort of lay it out and explain the ramifications for saving money here, or doing this, or swapping that out, or is there another way of doing something? And those decisions are made. But again, it continues all the way through. You have an educated client. They know what they're doing. They know why they're doing it. And at the end of the day, they were part of that decision process.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about the future. And I want to open this question to all of us. Ethan, I want to hear the future from standards perspective, but really, where do we see the future of acoustics and acoustic design in these workplace environments? Where do you all see this going?
Well, one of the things that I think is a trend that's going to continue is seeing hybrid products, things that are like light fixtures that have acoustic properties, things that are surprising in how they also improve acoustics. I think we're going to see more and more of that. There's been a huge change in how we approach what an acoustic material is, and I think the hospitality trend that we see in design has been a real help also, because I think intuitively we knew that those warm and fuzzy materials would actually make for a better acoustical environment. I mean, I think when we think about hospitality, we think about a pleasant environment. Part of the reason we think about it as pleasant is because acoustically it's also a pleasant place to be in. And so I think we're going to see continuing trends towards more soft materials, more rugs, more soft furniture, less formality in the workplace that's going to really help us with some of these issues and how to solve them.
I think the other filter that the group wanted to put on this part of the conversation as we look ahead relates to the two images here on the screen. And so the image on the left shows a project. It's an individual who's seated. And I think when you think about human needs and the design requirements for an individual person and you multiply it by a community, it's your client base. But what I think really we're focusing on now is in the last 3 years, clients have been coming to us increasingly and asking us, how do we address the needs of a growing neurodiverse population in their workforce? And this is a population, of course, it's a workforce project or a workplace project, but really it's people in this room. It's people who are traveling. It's the world that we live in. And there's a wonderful opportunity in a marriage between hybrid product, between evolvement of tactile sensory environments, and where are the places in a project that dig deeper than all of the layers we've been adding to make the richness of these projects perform in differing ways for differing settings, for different types of communities. And so whether it's tactile, whether it's textured, whether it's olfactory and sensory related and relates to biomimicry or sustainability, a great deal of product out there meets the criteria for texture, contrast, light and brightness, multiplicity. But I think the needs of this population and the growing requests by clients to ask us how we've designed for this group, what are we thinking about from a future thinking standpoint. It's been a big initiative at HOK for the last 3 years. We published a white paper on our website that was released in August. We worked with a medical team and actually hired a medical professional who is now a part of our thought leadership team within the organization. We're not the only firm or consultancy out there doing that. We're one of many. It's a bandwagon we jumped on, but we actually think it's not a trend. We actually think it's a criteria for human performance that's not going to go away. In fact, it's only going to grow and further emerge.
I think we're seeing that too with development of the well building standard, for instance, in what we were mentioning before, and I'll say it again, is this idea of effective and meaningful surveying to determine what high performance looks like. And neurodiversity is popping up even in my own feature development for the sound concept, but I know for light, mind, et cetera, throughout the entire standard. What do these diverse populations require for high performance space in the built environment? In addition to that, too, is looking also at what does the built environment do to serve not only that population, but populations that we're seeing trending with remote workforce that do have to dial in sort of virtually into what are otherwise static and physical built environment spaces. And I think that tying that back into managing and assessing workplace efficiency and high performance workplace parameters is, I think, for experts like those who are experts in acoustics, like some up here and out in the audience, is, I guess, being honest with ourselves and realizing that acoustics is also a very young science, and that there's so much opportunity to understand what latest and forthcoming research can do to bolster some of the claims in terms of bolstering high performance built environment spaces. But I guess overall, that's what we're looking at right now, is to amass what the current research says, what case studies that have looked into neurodiversity are showing in terms of how that can relate back to product or design considerations, and then seeing where we go from there. But I think that it is one of the biggest opportunities in terms of evaluation and verification.
That word research keeps coming up, and I think for a good reason. As Bill mentioned, many firms are looking at that. I know we have a neurologist on our staff who basically specializes in two things. One is the effect of light on workers, and the other is on acoustics. And I think as we get more and more knowledgeable, the kinds of solutions we'll come up with, which will really impact your work, John, will morph and change as time goes forward. We'll also get better tools to model spaces. I think that's another thing that's probably happening, and you can probably talk to that. Technology to model how a space will perform.
No, we do that, but I think the overriding factor of why acoustics is important and where the trends are and why the trends have come is that people today don't and won't just sit there and say that the space is okay and they're going to take what they're given. It's like they understand that their physical environment is important to them, and it's something that they speak up about, and that's why we have these surveys that show that it's the number 3 or so factor in an office space. And so the physical environment is extremely important, and now everything is revolving or evolving to respect that. And so we end up with products, we end up with studies, we end up with criteria, and it becomes more and more important. And so spaces have to be designed with that in mind. And that's, as you mentioned, modeling is one tool that we employ. This is to acoustics what computers were to architects. IMP never did the Dallas concert hall with all curved and three-dimensional planes without using a computer. Before that, it was fairly straightforward. Now with computers, architects do that. We can do similar studies and exercises on a digital platform to model and oralize spaces. And so, again, we go down this road with clients and we can make choices and show them the value of doing various things and obviously the negative effect of not following through with that. And so that's why technology has a role in this. But I think the big issue is like we expect more from our environment, and we have a quality of life, and acoustics is one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the manufacturer's standpoint, like I mentioned before, all of these changing needs and changing design trends and the experiential design and planning, it really does put the onus on the manufacturers to get creative and develop products that perform to meet those needs, and also, as you mentioned, Joan, to to do more than just one function. And so this image on the right that we see here, this is actually a conceptual product from USGS Ceilings Plus line, which is our specialty products. But it's our beams, and it's a vertical and horizontal baffle that is perforated and filled with absorptive material, so there's sound absorption there. There's also embedded LED lighting, and it's creating a space, right, without traditional walls. So we're trying to, take some of these needs and turn them into actual products. So that's, some of the forward thinking that's happening at USG right now. All right, well, on that note, we're gonna start to wrap things up. This is exactly the type of discussion and the questions that we wanted to get, so thank you to our panelists. And thank you for the wonderful questions and for making time, and thanks to our web audience for tuning in. I'm gonna pass it to Patty for some closing remarks.
As Andrew said, that was exactly the spirited discussion that we planned for this evening, so thank you all very much. One of the goals of this event was to use this event as a catalyst to continue this conversation. And what USG has done is they have created an acoustics page on usg.com. On that acoustics page will be a submittal sheet where all of you can request questions or information on this topic. One of the neatest things about tonight's event is it reveals what we call hot topics. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the video of tonight and analyze what those hot topics are. Every month on that acoustics page, we'll reach out to a thought leader who will dig deeper on that subject. So we really encourage you as professionals that if you want to weigh in on one of those topics, we would love to have your involvement. So again, I cannot thank you all enough for coming this evening. And again, a big round of applause for our panelists.